history is full of silences, not myths, not legends. Documented moments where the trail goes cold and no one has ever explained why. Somewhere between what we know and what we can prove, there's a space where the truth should be and isn't. That space is where this story lives. These aren't campfire stories. They're real gaps in the record, still unsolved. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. The Tower of London stands on the north bank of the Thames, its white keep rising above walls that have held prisoners, treasures, and secrets for nearly 1,000 years. Among its many chambers, one has drawn historians, forensic scientists, and the merely curious for over 5 centuries. A staircase in the White Tower, and beneath it in 1674, workmen discovered a wooden box containing 2 small skeletons. Who were they? The official answer has always been the same. Edward V, 12 years old, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, 9 years old. The last of their line to hold uncontested claim to the English throne. In 1483, following the death of their father, Edward IV, the boys were placed in the tower, officially for their protection, ostensibly to prepare for the elder's coronation. They were never seen in public again. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector. Within months, the princes were declared illegitimate. Richard was crowned king. By that autumn, rumors had already begun to circulate through London that the boys were dead. For over 500 years, the prevailing narrative has pointed to Richard III as their killer, a ruthless uncle clearing his path to the crown. It's the version Shakespeare immortalized, the version taught in most classrooms. But how much of it is fact, and how much is the product of Tudor propaganda, written by the dynasty that overthrew Richard just 2 years later? That is where the certainty begins to erode. No contemporary account describes the murder in detail. No confession survives from Richard's lifetime. The most famous version of events, that the boys were smothered in their sleep on Richard's orders, comes from Thomas More, writing decades later, under a Tudor monarch with every reason to blacken Richard's name. Was More recording history or completing it? Other suspects have been proposed. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, Richard's own ally, had access, motive, and a documented falling out with the king within months of the prince's disappearance. Could ambition have driven him to act alone? And what of Henry VII himself, who seized the throne in 1485 and had perhaps the strongest motive of all to ensure the boys, rival claimants, never resurfaced? The 1674 skeletons were examined in 1933 and judged consistent with 2 children of roughly the right ages. But the study predated modern forensic techniques, and no DNA testing has ever been permitted. The remains still rest in Westminster Abbey, sealed by royal decree. Every request to reopen the case, and there have been several, has been declined. So the question persists, not as speculation, but as an acknowledged gap in the historical record. Were these the princes at all? If so, who gave the order? And if the bones say nothing new, what else might still be waiting? Overlooked correspondence, unexamined household records, a confession buried in an archive no one has thought to search? For over 5 centuries, the tower has kept its silence. The stones remain, the staircase remains. Somewhere beneath the surface of what we're told happened, the truth may still be intact, waiting for someone with the right question and the right permission to find it. Some mysteries vanish the moment we open a locked door. Others only deepen. 400 miles from the Tower of London, in the climate-controlled vault of Yale University's Bineca Rare Book Library, sits an object that has resisted every attempt to unlock it for over a century, not because it's hidden, but because no one, in 600 years, has been able to read a single word of it. It's known as the Voynich Manuscript, named after the Polish book dealer, Wilfrid Voynich, who acquired it in 1912 from a Jesuit college in Italy. Bound in vellum, roughly 240 pages long, it looks at first glance like any other medieval codex until you try to read it. Every page is filled with flowing, elegant script written left to right, in an alphabet that resembles no known language on earth. Interspersed throughout are illustrations, strange plants that match no known species, star charts with unfamiliar constellations, and small nude figures bathing in networks of green liquid, connected by tubes and pipes like something from a biological diagram no botanist or physician of the era would recognize. Radiocarbon dating in 2009 placed the vellum's origin between 1404 and 1438, firmly in the early 15th century in Central Europe. The ink and pigments are consistent with that period as well, so the manuscript is not a modern forgery, at least not one built from modern materials. Someone, 600 years ago, sat down and filled nearly 240 pages with a text they clearly intended to be read. By someone. But by whom, and in what language? That is where the certainty ends and the mystery begins. The script has come to be called Voynichese. It follows consistent internal rules. Certain letters cluster in predictable ways. Word lengths follow a distinct pattern, and the text has the statistical rhythm of a real language rather than random scribbling. Linguists and cryptographers have spent decades running it through the same analytical tools used to crack real-world ciphers and lost scripts. And yet, unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs or Linear B, both of which yielded to patient decoding once the right key was found, the Voynich manuscript has given up nothing. No word has been reliably translated. No sentence has been confirmed to mean anything at all. Is it a lost or invented language? Is it an elaborate cipher, its true message hidden beneath a layer of substitution and code? Or is it something else entirely? A hoax constructed by a very patient hand, designed to look meaningful without meaning anything at all. Each theory has serious defenders, and each has serious problems. The cipher theory is perhaps the most intuitive. Medieval and Renaissance Europe had a rich tradition of coded writing, used by diplomats, alchemists, and scholars who wished to protect sensitive knowledge. Some researchers have proposed that the manuscript encodes a real language. Latin, or an early form of Hebrew or Ukrainian, scrambled through substitution or transposition. Yet every proposed solution, when tested rigorously, has failed to produce consistent, meaningful text across the entire manuscript. Patterns that seem to work for one page break down on the next. The invented language theory takes a different approach. Perhaps Voynichese isn't a code concealing another language, but a constructed language in its own right. What linguists call a glossolalia, or an artificial script, created for reasons we may never fully understand. Religious visionaries and mystics of the period sometimes claimed to receive sacred alphabets through divine revelation. Could the manuscript be one such attempt, a private spiritual language given form? Then there is the botanical mystery, which deepens things further rather than resolving them. Roughly a third of the manuscript is devoted to plant illustrations, and many appear nowhere in the natural world. Not in the historical botanical texts of Europe, not in the herbals of the Islamic world, not anywhere. A handful of researchers have proposed connections to plants found in the Americas, which would be extraordinary, given that the manuscript predates any confirmed European contact with the continent by several decades. Most scholars remain skeptical of this theory, and rightly so. The evidence is thin. But the plants themselves remain unidentified all the same, and that fact alone resists easy explanation. And then there is the hoax theory, which cannot be entirely dismissed either. Wilfrid Voynich was, after all, a dealer, and manuscripts with mysterious provenance have always commanded higher prices than ordinary ones. Could this be an elaborate 15th or 16th century forgery, produced to deceive a wealthy patron out of gold, its meaningless script generated through some mechanical or algorithmic process? Statistical analysis has shown the text does have some of the telltale irregularities of constructed gibberish, but it also shows a level of internal consistency that most historians agree would have been almost impossible to fake convincingly by hand, in an age with no computers, no statistical theory, and no way to verify whether the deception was working. So the manuscript sits in its vault, photographed, scanned, digitized, and made freely available online to anyone who wishes to try their hand at it. Cryptographers, with access to modern computing power, artificial intelligence trained on thousands of known languages, and teams of dedicated amateurs have all taken their turn. Still, no consensus has emerged. What was its author trying to say? Was it real knowledge, coded and guarded, medical, alchemical, astronomical? Was it a private world built from imagination alone, meant for no eyes but the author's own? Or was it never meant to say anything at all, only to appear as though it did? 600 years after it was written, the Voynich Manuscript remains exactly what it was when Wilfrid Voynich first opened its pages, a book that speaks fluently in a language no one has ever understood. Not every unsolved mystery hides in a locked vault or beneath a staircase. Some hide in plain sight, inside documents everyone has already read, waiting for someone to notice that the story doesn't quite add up. Berkeley Castle rises from the Gloucestershire countryside in southwest England, its Norman keep softened by centuries of ivy and quiet English rain. Inside, a chamber on the upper floor is still shown to visitors as the place where, on the night of September 21st, 1327, King Edward II of England was murdered. The official account, repeated in chronicles for centuries, is almost too vivid to be forgotten. Edward, deposed months earlier by his wife, Queen Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, was held prisoner at Berkeley under the custody of Lord Thomas Berkeley and a jailer named John Maltravers. According to the most sensational chronicles, written years after the fact, Edward was pinned down and killed with a red-hot iron, inserted internally so that his body would show no external wound. It's a detail almost designed to be remembered, gruesome, symbolic, and, many historians now argue, almost certainly invented. Because here is where the certainty of the story begins to fracture. No official record from 1327 describes the manner of Edward's death. The horrifying execution method appears only in chronicles written a decade or more later, well after Isabella and Mortimer had already fallen from power and a new narrative, useful to new rulers, was taking shape. Was it truth, preserved by witnesses too afraid to speak sooner? Or was it a story shaped to make a deposed king's death feel like divine punishment for his failures as a ruler? Even stranger is what happened next. Edward's body, so the official record states, lay in state at Berkeley for a month before burial at Gloucester Abbey, viewable only from a distance, its face reportedly covered. Contemporary accounts note that the embalmers who prepared the body were paid, and that local people were permitted to view it, but only briefly, and only certain features. For a king whose death was meant to be publicly, unambiguously confirmed, the arrangements seem, to some historians, oddly restrained. Then, in 1997, a document surfaced that reopened the entire question. Known as the Fieschi Letter, it had actually been discovered decades earlier, in 1878, in a French archive, but its implications weren't seriously examined until historian Ian Mortimer revisited it at the close of the 20th century. The letter was written by a papal notary named Manuel Fieschi to Edward III, the son of the supposedly dead king, sometime in the 1330s. In it, Fieschi claims that Edward II did not die at Berkeley Castle at all. According to the letter, a servant helped the king escape, killed a member of the household who resembled him, and presented the substitute's body as the king's own. The real Edward, Fieschi claims, fled to Ireland, then to France, and eventually lived out his final years disguised as a hermit in Italy, at a monastery near Sesima, where he supposedly died as late as the 1340s. Is this plausible? On its surface, it sounds like the kind of legend that attaches itself to deposed monarchs throughout history. The once and future king, hidden away, waiting. And yet the Fieschi letter contains details that are difficult to dismiss. It correctly describes elements of Edward's captivity and escape route that would have been extraordinarily difficult for a random forger, decades later, to know or guess. Manuel Fieschi was not some fringe figure inventing tales for attention. He was a well-connected clergyman with ties to the English court, in a position to have received privileged information. Adding further weight to the question, historians have noted something curious about Edward III's behavior in the years following his father's supposed death. In 1330, 3 years after the burial at Gloucester, Edward III had Roger Mortimer executed, officially for the murder of the former king. And yet, that same year, Edward III is recorded making a private, unexplained visit to the continent, traveling to Cologne and then to Koblenz, under circumstances his own court chroniclers never fully clarified. Some historians have speculated, cautiously, that this journey may have included a secret meeting with the man in Fieschi's account. A father the son needed to see for himself, one final time, in order to know the truth. Most mainstream historians remain doubtful, noting there were legitimate diplomatic reasons for Edward III to be on the continent that year. But the coincidence, however explainable, has never entirely gone away. Skeptics point out reasonably that the Fieschi letter could simply be an elaborate confidence scheme, an attempt by a foreign clergyman to extract favor or payment from a young king eager for any word of his troubled father. Isabella and Mortimer had every political reason to want Edward II unquestionably dead, and a body was produced, examined, and buried according to the customs of the time. The simplest explanation, as it so often is, may be the correct one. And yet the questions remain, unresolved after nearly 7 centuries. Why does the earliest, most grotesque account of the murder only appear years after the fact? Why were the funeral viewings so restricted, for a death that needed no concealment if it were genuine? What did Manuel Fieschi know, and how did he come to know it? And what precisely was Edward III doing in Koblenz in the autumn of 1330? Berkeley Castle still stands, its chamber still shown to visitors as the site of a murder that may, or may not, have actually taken place. Somewhere between the chronicle and the letter, between the body that was buried and the hermit who may have lived on in quiet exile, the truth of Edward II's ending remains exactly where it has always been, just out of reach. If Edward II's story teaches us that even a body in a grave can leave room for doubt, the next mystery asks a different question entirely. What happens when there's no body, no grave, and no record at all of where something went? On a quiet street in central Paris stands a stretch of pavement outlined in cobblestone, marking the outline of a fortress that no longer exists. The temple, headquarters of the Knights Templar in France, demolished centuries ago. Nothing rises above ground now but a metro station bearing its name. But beneath the streets of Paris, and in the folklore of a dozen countries, the shadow of what once stood there has never quite disappeared. The Knights Templar were founded around 1119, in the aftermath of the First Crusade, initially as a small group of knights dedicated to protecting pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Within 2 centuries, they had become one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Christendom, not merely a military order, but a vast financial network. Templar preceptories stretched across Europe and the Crusader states, and the order developed something remarkably close to an early international banking system, issuing letters of credit that allowed pilgrims to deposit funds in one country and withdraw them safely in another. They owned land, ships, and fortresses. They answered to the Pope alone, above the reach of any king. And then, on Friday, October 13th, 1307, it all came apart in a single coordinated strike. King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt, reportedly to the Templars themselves, ordered the simultaneous arrest of every Templar in France. The charges were severe: heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, and a range of secret initiation rites that, under torture, a number of knights confessed to. Grand Master Jacques de Molay was among those arrested. 7 years later, in 1314, he was burned at the stake in Paris, reportedly still maintaining the order's innocence to the end. Under pressure from Philip, Pope Clement VIII formally dissolved the order in 1312. What happened to their wealth is where the historical record simply stops. By every account, the Templars possessed an enormous treasury, the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of donations, banking operations, and property across an entire continent. Yet, when royal officials arrived at the Paris temple to seize it on the day of the arrests, the treasury was reportedly empty. Not diminished, empty. Whatever had been kept there was gone, and no reliable record has ever surfaced explaining where it went, or who moved it, or when. This is where mainstream historical explanation offers a reasonably grounded answer, and where speculation begins to build atop it. Some historians argue there was no vast, mysterious hoard to begin with, that the Templars' wealth was mostly tied up in land, debts owed to them, and property that was gradually absorbed by the French crown and, later, by the Knights Hospitaller, who inherited many of the order's assets by papal decree. On this view, the lost treasure is less a mystery than an accounting problem, the natural result of a complex financial network collapsing under sudden political pressure. But this explanation has never fully satisfied everyone, in part because of what happened just before the arrests. Historical records confirm that in the weeks leading up to October 13, 1307, a convoy left the Paris temple, and that word of the coming arrests appears to have reached at least some Templars before Philip's men arrived. Was this coincidence or warning? If members of the order had advanced knowledge, even partial, could they have moved a portion of their wealth out of the country before the trap closed? From here, the theories multiply and their evidentiary footing grows steadily thinner. One long-standing legend holds that Templar ships slipped out of the French port of La Rochelle before the arrests, carrying the order's treasury towards Scotland, a kingdom then under excommunication and thus outside the reach of Philip and the Pope alike. Some versions of this theory connect the fleeing Templars to Roslin, Scotland, and the construction of Roslin Chapel decades later, pointing to its unusual, densely symbolic stonework as evidence of Templar influence, if not treasure, embedded in the building itself. Mainstream historians remain highly skeptical of this connection, noting there is no direct documentary evidence tying the chapel's founder to the order. Others have proposed that surviving Templars and their wealth found refuge in Portugal, where the order was not suppressed but simply rebranded, reconstituted almost immediately as the Order of Christ, a transformation historians agree did happen, even if what, precisely, transferred along with it remains unclear. Still others have pointed further afield, toward Oak Island off the coast of Nova Scotia, where a centuries-old excavation site, nicknamed the Money Pit, has drawn treasure hunters since the 18th century, some of whom have speculated, without confirmed evidence, about a Templar connection stretching across the Atlantic nearly 2 centuries before Columbus. It remains, by any rigorous historical standard, unproven, but the absence of proof has done little to slow the searching. What is certain is this: an order that controlled one of medieval Europe's largest financial networks was dismantled in a single day, and its treasury, whatever it consisted of, was never found. Was it quietly absorbed into the ordinary machinery of medieval finance, dispersed among debts and estates until it simply ceased to exist as a single, findable thing? Or did some portion of it leave France before the soldiers arrived, carried by knights who saw the arrests coming? 700 years later, the ground beneath the Paris Temple has been built over many times, and no definitive trace of Templar gold has ever been recovered anywhere in the world. The order left behind fortresses, legal documents, and a legend that has never stopped growing in the space where the facts run out. Some mysteries, and with a body that shouldn't be there. Others, and with no body at all. Only silence, spreading outward from the last confirmed sighting of a man who simply stopped appearing in the historical record. In the hills of mid-Wales, near the village of Llandrillo, a rocky, windswept outcrop known as Glyndŵr still bears the name of the man who once held it, and who vanished from history so completely that even the manner and date of his death remain, to this day, unconfirmed. Owain Glyndŵr was born around 1354 into Welsh nobility, educated in London, trained in English law, and by most accounts fully assimilated into the world of the English gentry he served. And yet in 1400, at roughly the age of 46, he did something remarkable. He led a national uprising against English rule in Wales, the last of its kind Wales would ever see. What began as a personal land dispute with a neighboring English lord escalated, within weeks, into a full-scale rebellion. Glyndŵr was proclaimed Prince of Wales by his followers, and for nearly a decade he did something no Welsh leader before him had managed. He held territory, convened a Welsh parliament at Machynlleth, negotiated formal alliances with France and rebellious factions in England itself, and even outlined plans for 2 Welsh universities and an independent Welsh church. For a period, it looked as though an independent Wales might genuinely be possible. Then, gradually, it wasn't. English forces under the future Henry V began reclaiming Welsh strongholds one by one. Glyndŵr's allies fell away or were captured. His own family was taken prisoner in 1409, including his wife and several of his children, who were sent to the Tower of London, and Owain Glyndŵr, the man at the center of the entire rebellion, simply disappeared into the Welsh hills. This is where the historical record, ordinarily so meticulous about the fates of medieval rebels, goes strangely quiet. Unlike most enemies of the English crown, Glyndŵr was never captured. He was never tried. He was never executed, displayed, or definitively confirmed dead by any English official record, an extraordinary gap given how thoroughly the crown documented the deaths and punishments of other rebels from the same uprising. Henry V, who became king in 1413, is recorded offering Glyndŵr a formal pardon that same year, an offer that would only make sense if the king believed, or at least suspected, that Glyndŵr was still alive and still at large. No response to that pardon survives. No further mention of Owain Glyndŵr appears in any official English document afterward. So, where did he go, and when precisely did he die? The most widely accepted answer among historians rests on a single, brief entry, recorded years later by a French chronicler named Adam of Usk, who noted that Glyndŵr died in obscurity sometime around 1415, apparently of natural causes, in hiding. It's a plausible account, consistent with a man in his 60s, exhausted by over a decade of war, living out his final years away from public life. But Adam of Usk offers no location for the death, no burial site, and no first-hand witness. It is, at best, second-hand information, recorded by a chronicler who was not present and who may himself have simply been repeating rumor. From here, the local folklore takes over where the official record leaves off, and it has never entirely gone quiet. One long-standing tradition holds that Glyndŵr spent his final years not in hiding out of fear, but in quiet retirement with one of his daughters, Alice, who had married an English gentleman named John Scudamore and lived at Monnington Straddle in Herefordshire, just across the Welsh border. According to this account, Glyndŵr lived there peacefully under his family's protection, his identity known but deliberately unrecorded, protected by a community unwilling to hand him over even after all those years. Several sites in the area, including a mound near Monnington Church, have long been associated with local claims of his burial, though no grave has ever been formally identified and no remains have ever been examined. Other traditions place his final resting place elsewhere entirely, at Sycarth, his former home, now reduced to little more than earthworks in a Denbighshire field, or in one of several unmarked locations across mid-Wales, each supported by nothing more than generations of local memory passed down without documentation. Unlike the disappearance of Edward II, there is no letter, no formal claim from a rival court, no single competing document offering an alternative account to weigh against the official story. There is, instead, simply an absence, a rebellion that ends not with a death recorded in any court or chronicle written by someone who was there, but with a man who walked into the hills and, as far as the historical record is concerned, never walked back out. Why did England, so thorough in punishing every other figure connected to the uprising, never confirm what became of the man who led it? Why offer a pardon to someone believed dead? And why, across 6 centuries, has no single site ever produced verifiable evidence of where Owain Glyndŵr's story actually ended? The hills of mid-Wales keep their silence still. Somewhere among them, if the old traditions are to be believed, lies the answer, unmarked, unconfirmed, and, so far, undiscovered. A single man vanishing into the hills is one kind of mystery. An entire society vanishing from an entire landmass is another kind altogether. On the southwestern coast of Greenland, where fjords cut deep into rock scoured bare by ice, the grass-covered outlines of stone foundations still trace the shape of a church, a cathedral, and dozens of farmsteads, the remains of Norse settlements that thrived here for nearly 5 centuries, and then, sometime in the 1400s, ceased to exist entirely. The Eastern Settlement, as it's known to archaeologists, was founded around 985 by Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland after a killing, who sailed west and found, along Greenland's southern coastline, land fertile enough to support farming and grazing. He named it Greenland, according to the sagas, precisely to make it sound appealing to future settlers. An early piece of marketing for one of the most isolated colonies in the medieval world. It worked. Within decades, an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 Norse settlers had established 2 colonies along the coast, the eastern and western settlements, building farms, raising livestock, and constructing churches, including a cathedral at Gardar complete with an imported bronze bell and a resident bishop appointed directly by the Archbishop of Nidaros in Norway. For nearly 500 years, this was not a lost outpost clinging to survival. It was a functioning European society, connected by trade to Norway and, through Norway, to the wider medieval world. Records confirm the Greenland colonies paid papal taxes in walrus ivory, exported goods, including furs, and live polar bears as royal gifts, and maintained regular, if infrequent, contact with Europe. A 1408 marriage recorded in the church at Hvalsey, still the best preserved Norse structure in Greenland today, stands as the last confirmed written record of the eastern settlement's population. describing an entirely ordinary event. A wedding, witnessed, documented, filed away in official church records like thousands of others across medieval Christendom, and then, after that entry, nothing. No further correspondence, no final report, no documented evacuation, disaster, or collapse. When European ships eventually returned to the Greenland coast in the following century, they found the settlements empty. Not one confirmed survivor was ever recorded speaking to what had happened. So, what happened to 2,000 to 3,000 people? The most widely supported explanation among historians and archaeologists is climatic. The onset of what's known as the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long cooling period that began affecting the North Atlantic in the 1300s, gradually shortening growing seasons, expanding sea ice, and making the already difficult voyage between Greenland and Norway more dangerous and less frequent. Ice core and sediment data confirm the cooling was real and significant. Under this reading, the Norse Greenlanders, dependent on livestock farming and increasingly cut off from European trade and reinforcement, may have simply faced a slow, grinding decline. Dwindling harvests, dwindling population, until the last survivors either died out or, more likely, left. That last possibility, that they left rather than perished, has gained increasing support from recent archaeological work. Excavations at Norse farmsteads have found surprisingly few burials from the settlement's final decades, and little evidence of catastrophic violence or famine at the very end. Some researchers now argue that the most plausible ending isn't a single dramatic collapse, but a gradual, deliberate withdrawal, as remaining families abandoned failing farms and sailed back to Iceland or Norway in the ordinary course of resettlement, leaving behind a colony that ended not with catastrophe, but with an unremarkable, unrecorded departure. But this explanation, however reasonable, doesn't answer every question, and it's here that more speculative theories begin to fill the remaining gaps. One persistent theory involves conflict with the Inuit, who had migrated into the same region of Greenland during the settlement's final centuries, and who, unlike the Norse, had generations of accumulated expertise in surviving Arctic conditions. Norse sagas and later accounts mention encounters with a people they called the Skraeling, and some make reference to conflict. Archaeological evidence for sustained large-scale warfare between the two groups remains limited, however, and many historians now favor a more complicated picture of intermittent contact, sometimes hostile, sometimes not, rather than a single decisive conflict that ended the colony. Other theories point to disease, possibly introduced through the very European trade ships that connected Greenland to the wider world, striking a population that may already have been weakened by generations of deteriorating harvests. Still, others have proposed that a portion of the colony didn't perish or leave at all, but instead assimilated into Inuit communities over multiple generations, intermarrying, adopting Inuit survival techniques, and gradually losing the distinct cultural identity that would have marked them as Norse in any surviving record. This theory remains difficult to prove or disprove conclusively, though some genetic and archaeological research in the region continues to explore the question. What makes the Greenland colony's disappearance different from a single missing king or a lost treasury is its sheer scale. This was not one person slipping into the hills or one fortune vanishing in a single day. This was thousands of people, across dozens of farmsteads and 2 full settlements, over a period of decades, and somewhere in that gradual unraveling, the written record simply stops keeping pace with what was actually happening on the ground. Did they starve in slow motion as the ice crept further south each year? Did they fight and lose against a people better suited to survive where they could not? Did they leave quietly in ships whose logs were never preserved? Or did some of them simply become something else entirely, absorbed into a different community their Norse identity dissolving until there was no one left to call themselves the last of Greenland's settlers. The stone foundations remain, half sunk into grass that grows green again each summer, in a landscape that has long since stopped keeping their names. Not every mystery in this history is about absence. A missing body, a vanished treasure, a colony gone quiet. Some are about presence, something happening, in full view of an entire town, that no one at the time could explain, and that no one since has been able to fully explain either. In the summer of 1374, in the streets of Aachen, in the Holy Roman Empire, witnesses recorded something that reads, even in the dry language of medieval chronicles, almost like a fever dream. Groups of people dancing without music, without apparent reason, and without the ability to stop. The chronicles describe it beginning in Aachen and spreading rapidly along the Rhine, through towns including Cologne, Metz, and Strasbourg, as the summer went on. Those affected, by contemporary accounts, danced for hours, sometimes days, in the streets and churchyards, screaming, weeping, and calling out the names of demons or saints as they moved. Witnesses described dancers with swollen, bleeding feet, some of whom reportedly collapsed from exhaustion, and some of whom, according to later and less reliable accounts, may have died from the strain. The affliction spread through entire communities, drawing in what chroniclers described as hundreds of participants, moving from town to town along the river almost like a contagion. This was not an isolated report from a single unreliable source. Multiple chroniclers across multiple towns recorded similar events that same year, describing crowds overtaken by an uncontrollable urge to dance, seemingly against their own will. It would not be the last such episode in the region's history. A similar and more thoroughly documented outbreak would strike Strasbourg over a century later, in 1518. But the 1374 episode was the first to be recorded at this scale, and it set the pattern that later outbreaks would follow. So, what actually caused it? The explanation favored by medieval authorities at the time was spiritual. Many contemporaries believed the afflicted had been cursed, possessed, or were being punished by a saint, specifically Saint John the Baptist or Saint Vitus, whose intervention was sometimes sought to end the affliction, and whose name would later become permanently attached to the phenomenon as Saint Vitus's dance. Religious processions and rituals were organized in several affected towns, in the hope of driving out whatever force was believed responsible. Whether these interventions had any effect, or whether the episodes simply ran their course on their own, the chronicles don't clearly say. Modern historians and researchers have proposed several competing explanations, none of which fully accounts for every detail in the surviving record. The most frequently cited theory involves ergot poisoning, a toxic mold that grows on damp rye, common in the diet of medieval peasants, particularly during wet growing seasons. Ergot contains compounds chemically related to LSD, and ergot poisoning, known as ergotism, can produce hallucinations, muscle spasms, and convulsions. The theory holds real scientific plausibility, and outbreaks of ergotism are well documented elsewhere in medieval Europe. But critics of this explanation point out that ergot poisoning typically produces other severe symptoms, gangrene in its dry form, along with vomiting and diarrhea, that go entirely unmentioned in the chronicles describing the dancing itself. Nor does ergotism easily explain the coordinated, purposeful movement described by witnesses, or the apparent spread of the affliction from town to town over the following weeks, in a pattern that doesn't cleanly match how a foodborne toxin would typically behave. A second explanation, favored by a number of modern historians, including medical historian John Waller, points toward psychogenic illness, a form of mass psychological stress response triggered by extreme social conditions. The 1370s in the Rhineland followed decades of catastrophe. The Black Death had swept through the region a generation earlier, killing a significant portion of the population, and the years leading up to 1374 had brought severe flooding and famine to the same towns that would later report dancing. Under this theory, the dancing mania may have been a form of collective psychological breakdown, a stress-induced trance state, spreading through a population already primed by trauma and belief in curses, saints, and supernatural affliction, in communities where such an episode, once begun, could plausibly spread through observation and suggestion rather than any physical toxin at all. Neither theory, on its own, accounts for everything. Ergotism explains the physical symptoms but struggles with the pattern of spread and the absence of other telltale signs of poisoning. Mass psychogenic illness explains the social spread and the trance-like, ritualistic behavior, but is difficult to verify definitively, centuries after the fact, given the limits of the surviving evidence. Fringe theories have occasionally gone further still, suggesting deliberate participation in a forbidden religious cult or symptoms consistent with epidemic encephalitis, though neither has gained meaningful support among historians studying the primary sources. What remains, 6.5 centuries later, is a set of chronicle entries written by multiple observers in multiple towns, describing something none of them could adequately explain even as they watched it happen. Was it a toxin in the grain, working through entire communities the way ergot is known to do elsewhere? Was it a form of collective psychological collapse, born from a generation that had already buried its dead by the thousands, and had every reason to believe some judgment was still to come? Or was it something the chroniclers simply lacked the vocabulary to describe accurately, lost somewhere between what they witnessed and what they were able to write down? Along the banks of the Rhine, the towns that once watched their neighbors dance until they collapsed have long since returned to ordinary life. The chronicles remain brief and strange, describing a summer when an entire region seemed to move to music no one could hear. If Aachene's mystery is one of unexplained presence, the next belongs to a quieter, more familiar kind of loss, the slow disappearance of something valuable, not through a single dramatic event, but through decades of neglect, war, and scattering, until only fragments remain to prove it ever existed at all. In Budapest, within the collections of the National Széchenyi Library, a small number of ornate manuscripts sit under careful preservation, their pages illuminated in gold leaf and brilliant color, bound in velvet and silver clasps. They are called Corvini, and they are among the last confirmed survivors of what was once considered the finest library in Europe outside the Vatican. That library belonged to Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary from 1458 to 1490, a Renaissance monarch whose reputation for scholarship rivaled his reputation as a ruler. Matthias, educated and multilingual, became obsessed, in the way only a Renaissance prince could afford to be, with assembling a collection of the finest texts available anywhere in the known world. Contemporary accounts describe a workshop in Florence, staffed by dozens of scribes and illuminators, working specifically to produce manuscripts for the Hungarian king. At its height, the Bibliotheca Corviniana is believed to have held somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 codices, covering philosophy, science, astronomy, history, and theology drawn from Greek, Roman, Arabic, and contemporary Renaissance sources, a collection that placed Buda, Matthias's capital, among the most significant centers of learning in Europe, alongside the Vatican Library and the great libraries of Florence. And then, within a matter of decades, it was gone. Matthias died in 1490, without a legitimate heir prepared to continue his work, and the library he had spent a lifetime assembling began, almost immediately, to decline. Subsequent Hungarian kings lacked the resources, and perhaps the inclination, to maintain a collection of that scale. But the true catastrophe came in 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, where the Kingdom of Hungary suffered a devastating defeat against the Ottoman Empire. Buda itself fell to Ottoman forces in 1541, and in the chaos of conquest and occupation that followed, the royal library, by then already diminished, was largely dispersed. Manuscripts were looted, destroyed, or carried away as spoils of war. Of the 2,000 to 3,000 volumes believed to have existed at the library's height, roughly 216 are confirmed to survive today, scattered across more than 40 institutions worldwide, from Budapest to Vienna, from the Vatican to Istanbul, from Wolfenbüttel to New York. That leaves, by conservative estimate, well over 2,000 manuscripts entirely unaccounted for. Where did they go? The most straightforward and most widely accepted explanation is simple attrition through war. Manuscripts looted during the fall of Buda would likely have been scattered among Ottoman forces, some potentially destroyed outright, others possibly absorbed into libraries across the Ottoman Empire, including, some historians have proposed, the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul, though systematic searches there have identified only a handful of confirmed Corvinian volumes. Others may simply have been lost to fire, neglect, or the ordinary decay that claims paper and vellum left unprotected over centuries, particularly during a period as chaotic as Hungary's Ottoman occupation, which lasted well over a century. This explanation accounts for a great deal, but it doesn't fully satisfy historians and researchers who have spent careers attempting to trace the library's remains, in part because of how unevenly the losses appear. Some manuscripts remarkably survived the fall of Buda intact, and eventually resurfaced in European royal and ecclesiastical collections decades or even centuries later, suggesting that a portion of the collection was deliberately preserved, sold, or gifted rather than simply destroyed in the chaos of a conquest. If some volumes were saved through deliberate action, what became of the rest? Were they treated with equal care by whoever took possession of them, or did most simply vanish through indifference, unrecognized for what they were by those who acquired them? A more speculative line of inquiry has focused on the possibility that a significant portion of the library was never looted at all, but rather hidden, deliberately concealed, either by Hungarian nobility attempting to protect it before Buda fell, or by librarians and scholars within the royal court itself, in anticipation of the coming Ottoman advance. Proponents of this theory point to the sheer scale of the discrepancy between what's known to have existed and what has ever resurfaced, arguing that outright destruction, however plausible during a violent conquest, doesn't fully explain why so few additional volumes have turned up across 5 centuries of subsequent excavation, archival research, and the collapse of numerous empires that might otherwise have released such treasures back into wider circulation. Mainstream historians remain cautious about this theory, noting the absence of any confirmed hiding place and the reasonable likelihood that war, fire, and time account for most of what's missing without requiring a deliberate concealment at all. Excavations beneath Buda Castle, conducted intermittently since the 20th century, have uncovered architectural remains connected to the royal court of Matthias's era, along with fragments of decorative stonework confirming the scale and ambition of his building projects. No cache of manuscripts has ever been found among them. Whether that absence reflects a library that was simply and thoroughly destroyed, or one whose surviving remnants are still waiting somewhere, undiscovered, in an archive, a private collection, or a sealed chamber not yet identified, remains an open question that continues to draw scholars back to the same sparse historical record. What is certain is only this: a king once assembled one of the great libraries of the Renaissance world, and within 2 generations, all but a fraction of it had disappeared so completely that historians are still, after 5 centuries, counting the survivors 1 manuscript at a time, A library scattered by conquest is one kind of vanished fortune. A treasure deliberately buried by a ruler who trusted no one is another kind entirely. High above the Argeș River in Romania, accessible only by a punishing climb of over 1,400 steps, the ruined walls of Poenari Castle cling to a mountain ridge in the Carpathians. Wind moves freely through what remains of its towers now, but in the 15th century, this fortress served as the last stronghold of a ruler whose name would eventually eclipse his own historical record entirely. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, known to history as Vlad the Impaler, and to legend, centuries later, as Dracula. Vlad ruled Wallachia, a principality in what is now southern Romania, across 3 separate reigns between 1448 and 1476, a period defined by near-constant warfare against the expanding Ottoman Empire and by brutal, often theatrical methods of enforcing control over his own nobility. His reputation for impalement as both punishment and psychological warfare is extensively documented in contemporary German and Ottoman sources, some almost certainly exaggerated for propaganda purposes, though the core practice itself is not seriously disputed by historians. What's less discussed, but no less intriguing, is the question of what became of his wealth. Both his personal fortune and the resources of a principality that, despite its constant warfare, controlled valuable trade routes between Central Europe and the Ottoman world. In 1462, Vlad's fortunes collapsed, facing a massive Ottoman invasion under Sultan Mehmed II, and betrayed, according to several accounts, by his own brother Radu, who had allied with the Ottomans. Vlad was forced to abandon Poenari Castle in a desperate retreat. Chronicles describe his wife, her identity still debated among historians, choosing to leap from the castle walls into the river below rather than face capture, an episode still commemorated in local legend, with the river below the fortress sometimes referred to as the Râul Doamnei, the River of the Lady. Vlad himself escaped through a secret passage, reportedly with the help of local peasants, and fled into the mountains toward Transylvania, where he would eventually be imprisoned by the King of Hungary for over a decade before being restored, briefly, to power in 1476, only to be killed in battle that same year. It is in the chaos of that 1462 retreat that the question of Vlad's treasure begins. Wallachian princes of the period, particularly one engaged in nearly constant warfare, would have required significant reserves of gold and silver, for mercenaries, for fortifications, for the ordinary business of running a principality under siege. Some historical sources suggest Vlad also accumulated wealth through tribute, taxation, and the seizure of assets from nobles he executed or exiled during his purges of the Wallachian boyar class. Yet no official Wallachian treasury record from Vlad's reign survives describing the disposition of these funds, and no historical account confirms what happened to whatever wealth he possessed at the moment Poenari fell. The most straightforward, mainstream explanation offered by historians is that any treasure Vlad held was likely spent, seized, or scattered in the ordinary chaos of war, used to pay soldiers lost to Ottoman forces during the sack of his territory, or absorbed by the same nobility, both loyal and disloyal, who filled the power vacuum during his periods of imprisonment and exile. Wallachia, under continuous threat throughout the 15th century, was not a place where accumulated wealth typically survived one ruler's downfall intact. But local legend in the region surrounding Poenari has never fully accepted that explanation, and it points instead toward the mountain itself. According to persistent oral tradition passed down through villages near the Argeș River, Vlad, anticipating the fortress might fall, ordered treasure buried somewhere within the castle grounds or hidden in the surrounding cliffs before his escape. gold intended to fund a future return to power that never fully materialized. Some versions of the legend suggest the treasure was thrown into the river itself alongside his wife, sinking somewhere along the same stretch of water that still bears her name. Other versions describe hidden chambers within Poenari's foundations, sealed and never rediscovered, even after archaeological surveys of the ruins conducted across the 20th century. Those surveys have, to date, found no confirmed treasure. Excavations at Poenari have uncovered building foundations, defensive structures, and artifacts confirming the castle's occupation and eventual destruction, consistent with the historical record of Vlad's reign. No hoard of gold has surfaced. Whether that absence reflects a legend built entirely on the romantic appeal of a ruined mountaintop fortress and a doomed retreat, or a genuine cache still concealed somewhere within a landscape that has changed considerably over 5.5 centuries of erosion, rock slides, and river shifts, remains impossible to say with any certainty. Adding a further layer of uncertainty, some historians have noted that Vlad's personal wealth, whatever its scale, was never clearly distinguished in surviving records from the broader finances of the Wallachian state, making it difficult even to define what, precisely, a lost treasure would have consisted of. A private hoard belonging to Vlad alone, or simply the vanished operating funds of a principality that changed hands violently more than once across his 3 interrupted reigns. What remains certain is only the mountain itself, and the 1,300-plus steps that still lead visitors up to Poenari's ruins each year, past the cliffs where, according to the oldest stories still told in the villages below, a prince who trusted almost no one may have left something behind that no one has ever found. A buried fortune is, at least, a mystery with a fixed location. A mountain, a river, a single fortress where the answer either waits or doesn't. The next mystery offers no such anchor. It concerns not a place where something might be hidden, but an entire document whose very existence as a reliable record has been argued over for more than 4 centuries. In the Cora Museum in Venice, among the city's archives of maritime history, sits a printed map from 1558, ornate and confident in its detail, depicting islands across the North Atlantic that, according to most modern geographers, should not exist at all in the form the map describes them. The map accompanied a small published volume known as the Zeno narrative, released in Venice in 1558 by a nobleman named Niccolò Zeno the Younger. According to the book, it was compiled from letters and documents left behind by his ancestors, brothers Niccolò and Antonio Zeno, who had supposedly sailed the North Atlantic nearly 2 centuries earlier, around 1380, in service to a nobleman the narrative calls Prince Zikmni, ruler of islands referred to as Frieslanda and Estotiland. The account describes voyages far to the north and west of Europe, encounters with lands rich in resources, and, most strikingly, a journey to a place called Icaria, and beyond it, a land the narrative associates with Greenland, decades before Columbus's voyage to the Americas, and, depending on how certain passages are read, potentially reaching territory even further west. Was any of it true? That question has divided historians and cartographers since almost the moment the book was published. In favor of at least partial authenticity, historians note that Venice in the 14th century was, in fact, a significant maritime power, and Venetian sailors and traders are documented traveling widely across known trade routes of the period. A family named Zeno did hold genuine prominence in Venetian civic life across multiple generations, and some genealogical records do connect certain Zeno family members to maritime service. The 1558 narrative's publisher, Niccolò Zeno the Younger, was a real historical figure with undocumented interest in his family's archives, and the book was presented, at the time, as a straightforward act of family history rather than an obvious fabrication. And yet, the geography described in the accompanying map creates immediate and serious problems. Frieslanda, the island supposedly ruled by Zishmani, does not correspond to any confirmed landmass in the North Atlantic. Estadaland and Ikaria similarly fail to match any known geography with confidence, though generations of researchers have proposed various identifications. Estadaland as a garbled reference to Newfoundland, Ikaria as a corrupted memory of the Faroe Islands or the Orkneys. The map does depict Greenland with a level of coastal accuracy that some researchers have found difficult to explain for the supposed date of the original voyages, suggesting either a genuinely early and remarkably sophisticated navigational achievement, or, more skeptically, that the 1558 map incorporated more contemporary 16th century geographic knowledge, deliberately or otherwise, into what was presented as a 200-year-old account. This is where mainstream scholarly opinion has largely settled, though not without dissent. The prevailing academic view, developed over more than a century of cartographic and historical analysis, holds that the Zeno narrative is most likely a fabrication constructed by Niccolo Zeno the Younger, possibly to enhance his family's historical prestige, possibly incorporating fragments of genuine but garbled older Venetian maritime knowledge, and possibly influenced by other, more reliable, 14th and 15th century North Atlantic accounts that were circulating by the time of the 1558 publication. Under this reading, Zishmani may represent a distorted rendering of a real historical figure, with some researchers proposing a connection to Henry Sinclair, a Scottish Norse nobleman and Earl of Orkney active in the correct general period, though the connection remains speculative and is not accepted by all historians studying the case. But the skeptical consensus has never fully closed the matter, in part because outright fabrication doesn't cleanly explain every detail either. If Niccolo Zeno the Younger invented the voyages wholesale, why would he include so much geography that fails to align with the more impressive, better-known discoveries of his own era, rather than simply claiming a clean, confident route to a recognizable new world? Why construct a narrative whose confusions and inconsistencies would seem more likely to invite skepticism than admiration? Some researchers have taken this very awkwardness as indirect evidence that the narrative may be drawing, however imperfectly, on some genuine underlying source material. Old family papers, perhaps, or second-hand accounts of real voyages, transcribed and reproduced by a 16th century editor working with fragmentary, damaged, or simply confusing original documents. The fringe end of the theory spectrum has occasionally gone further, suggesting the Zeno brothers' voyages represent evidence of pre-Columbian European contact with North America nearly a century before Columbus, and, in its most speculative forms, connecting the narrative to later legends of the Newport Tower in Rhode Island and the Kensington Runestone in Minnesota, artifacts whose authenticity is itself heavily disputed by mainstream archaeologists and historians, who generally regard both as far more likely products of later centuries. No original 14th century Zeno letters have ever been located. What survives is only the 1558 printed narrative and its accompanying map, presented confidently to Venetian readers as family history, and received with uncertainty by nearly everyone who has studied it since. Were Niccolo and Antonio Zeno genuine North Atlantic explorers whose real voyages were distorted by 2 centuries of retelling and a confused 16th century transcription? Or does the entire account belong to a long tradition of Renaissance-era invented ancestry, dressed in just enough authentic detail to survive scrutiny for over 400 years? The map remains in Venice, its coastlines confident and its islands unresolved, describing a version of the North Atlantic that has never quite matched the ocean itself. A disputed map is a mystery of interpretation. What comes next is a mystery of a very different kind. One where the location is certain, the date is certain, and even the identity of the man responsible was, at the time, widely assumed. And yet, 5.5 centuries later, historians are still unable to say with full confidence what actually happened inside a small chamber in the Tower of London on the night of May 21st, 1471. The room is known today as the Wakefield Tower, a quiet, unassuming space within the larger fortress complex, marked now by a small plaque, and, since the 20th century, by an annual wreath laid in commemoration of the man who is believed to have died there, King Henry VI of England. Henry's life had been defined, almost from birth, by instability. Crowned King of England as an infant in 1422, and briefly, through inheritance, King of France as well, Henry grew into a monarch remembered by contemporaries as pious, gentle, and, by most surviving accounts, deeply unsuited to the brutal political demands of medieval kingship. His reign coincided with the loss of nearly all English territory in France, mounting government debt, and, from the 1450s onward, recurring bouts of what chroniclers described as a form of catatonic breakdown, during which the king became entirely unresponsive to those around him for months at a time. It was during one such episode, in 1453, that a council of nobles first assumed control of government in his place, planting the seeds of the dynastic conflict that would come to be known as the Wars of the Roses, a decades-long struggle between the rival houses of Lancaster and York for the English throne. Henry, a Lancastrian king, was captured, restored, deposed, and captured again across nearly 2 decades of shifting fortune. In 1461, the Yorkist claimant Edward IV seized the throne, forcing Henry into hiding and eventual imprisonment in the Tower of London by 1465. For nearly 6 years, Henry remained there as a prisoner, until a brief and remarkable reversal in 1470, when a temporary alliance restored him to the throne for a matter of months, a period historians refer to as the Readeption. It did not last. Edward IV returned from exile, defeated the Lancastrian forces decisively at the Battle of Tewkesbury in May 1471, and, according to the official Yorkist account published shortly afterward, Henry VI died in the Tower of London on the night of May 21st, or the early morning of May 22nd, of what the Crown described at the time as simple melancholy. Grief, in essence, over the destruction of his cause and the death of his only son, Edward of Westminster, killed at Tewkesbury just weeks earlier. Almost no one at the time believed that explanation, and the historical record itself makes clear why. Edward IV returned to London and entered the city in triumph on the very same day Henry died, or the day immediately before, depending on which chronicle account is followed. The timing, to contemporaries and to nearly every historian since, has always seemed difficult to accept as coincidence. Henry had survived years of imprisonment in reasonably stable health. His only son and heir, the last serious rival claimed to the Lancastrian succession, had just been killed in battle. And within hours of Edward's arrival in London as the unchallenged victor, the deposed king who had spent a decade as a living rallying point for Lancastrian resistance was suddenly dead, with no witnesses to the moment and no independent account of his final hours. The Yorkist chronicle known as the History of the Arrival, produced under the new regime's supervision, insists Henry died of natural causes, brought on by pure sorrow. But a rival account, the Warkworth Chronicle, written independently and closer in tone to the general suspicion of the period, states plainly that Henry was murdered, and names Edward IV's younger brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the same man who would, 12 years later, become king as Richard III, and who stands, as we've already seen, at the center of his own unresolved mystery involving 2 young princes in that same fortress. Modern forensic evidence has added weight, though not certainty, to the murder theory. When Henry's tomb at Windsor was opened in 1910, an examination of the skeletal remains found matted, apparently blood-stained hair on the skull, along with damage to the bone consistent, according to the examining surgeon, with a blow to the head. The findings were not conclusive by modern forensic standards, and no full modern re-examination with contemporary techniques has been permitted since. Still, the physical evidence available has generally reinforced what most historians already suspected from the political timing alone. Henry VI's death, however it was officially described, was almost certainly not the product of natural grief. Where genuine uncertainty remains is not in whether Henry was murdered, which the great majority of historians now accept as the most probable explanation, but in the precise chain of responsibility. Did Richard, Duke of Gloucester, act on Edward IV's direct order, as a loyal brother carrying out a necessary political execution? Did he act independently, anticipating what his brother would want without an explicit command? A distinction that mattered enormously to contemporaries weighing questions of guilt and honor, even if the practical result was identical. Or was the killing carried out by someone else entirely within the tower's garrison, acting on orders that were never formally recorded in any surviving document, with Richard's presence in London at the time creating an association that later Tudor-era writers, eager to blacken his name after Bosworth Field, were happy to cement into historical certainty? This is where the mystery of Henry VI intersects, in an unusually direct way, with the earlier questions surrounding the fate of Edward IV's own sons 12 years later. The same man stands at the center of both unresolved deaths in the same fortress, separated by little more than a decade. Was this simply the grim consistency of a ruthless political operator, willing to eliminate rivals whenever the crown required it? Or has one execution, whose author and method remain genuinely unclear, colored our reading of the second, whose author and method remain, if anything, even less certain? No confession survives. No independent eyewitness account describes what happened inside that chamber. Only a chronicle that names a killer, a rival chronicle that offers an explanation almost no one believed even at the time, and a skull, examined once in 1910, that has never been allowed to answer the question again. Henry VI's death, at least, took place on English soil, inside a fortress whose walls still stand and can still be visited. The mystery that follows begins in that same tangle of Plantagenet rivalry, but ends across the sea in a foreign town, inside a room no one can identify with certainty, in a killing that even the men who ordered it seemed determined never to fully explain. In Calais, then an English-held port on the northern coast of France, a building once stood known as the Prince's Inn, where, in September 1397, Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, the youngest surviving son of Edward III, and uncle to the reigning king, Richard II, was almost certainly murdered on royal orders, smothered, according to the most detailed surviving account, beneath a mattress or featherbed, by men acting in the king's name, in a killing so quietly managed that its exact location and method remain, to this day, matters of historical reconstruction rather than settled fact. Thomas of Woodstock had spent much of his adult life as one of the most powerful and dangerous men in England. As uncle to the young King Richard II, who had inherited the throne as a child in 1377, Thomas became a leading figure among a group of nobles known as the Lords Appellant, who in 1387 and 1388 moved decisively against Richard's inner circle, executing several of the king's closest advisors and, for a period, effectively stripping Richard of meaningful royal authority. Richard never forgot it. Chroniclers of the period are largely in agreement that the young king, humiliated and endangered by his uncle's actions during those years, spent much of the following decade patiently rebuilding his power with a single, deliberate goal: revenge against the men who had humbled him, and Thomas of Woodstock above all. That revenge came in July 1397, when Richard, having finally consolidated sufficient authority, ordered the arrest of Thomas along with 2 of his fellow former appellants. Thomas was taken not to an English prison, but across the Channel to Calais, placed in the custody of Thomas Mowbray, Earl of Nottingham, who held the post of Captain of Calais and who owed his position and his loyalty directly to King Richard. Within weeks, word reached England that Thomas of Woodstock had died in custody. The official explanation offered at the time was, once again, natural causes, though even by the flexible standards of medieval royal announcements, this one strained credulity from the outset. Thomas was in his early 40s, with no significant prior record of illness, and had been in apparently sound health at the time of his arrest just weeks earlier. When Parliament was convened that September, ostensibly to try Thomas for treason alongside his fellow former appellants, the king's officials were forced to acknowledge that the accused had already died, and the formal charges were read against him posthumously, a procedural oddity that only deepened contemporary suspicion that his death had been arranged specifically to avoid the complications of a public trial and the public defense he might otherwise have mounted. The clearest surviving account of what actually happened inside Calais comes from a confession attributed to John Hall, a member of the Calais garrison, extracted under interrogation nearly a decade later in 1399, after Richard II had himself been deposed by Henry IV and the new regime moved to formally investigate its predecessor's crimes. According to Hall's confession, Thomas was murdered on the direct orders of the king, carried out inside a chamber at an inn in Calais, where several men, including Hall himself, held Thomas down and smothered him, reportedly with a feather bed or heavy cloth, to avoid producing a wound that might complicate the official story of natural death. Should Hall's confession be trusted entirely? Here, the same complication that shadows so many of these medieval mysteries reappears in a new form. Hall's testimony was given under a new king, Henry IV, who had every political motive to confirm and publicize his predecessor's guilt, having seized the throne from Richard II just months earlier, and needing to justify that seizure to a nation still uncertain about the legitimacy of the change. A confession extracted under those circumstances from a low-ranking soldier facing serious legal jeopardy of his own carries the same inherent risk found in Thomas More's later account of the princes in the Tower, testimony shaped consciously or not, to serve the political needs of whoever is doing the recording. And yet, unlike some of the murkier cases in this ongoing exploration, several elements here align unusually well. Thomas Mowbray, the captain of Calais who had custody of Thomas of Woodstock at the time of his death, was later accused, in a separate and unrelated political dispute in 1398, of having played a direct role in the killing, an accusation made not by a hostile new regime, but by a fellow nobleman, Henry Bolingbroke, the future Henry IV, during Richard II's own reign, while Richard was still very much in power and had every reason to suppress such an accusation rather than allow it to surface. The fact that this claim emerged before the change of dynasty, rather than conveniently afterward, has led most historians to treat the broader outline of Thomas's murder, royal order, executed through Mowbray's custody, carried out quietly to avoid a public trial, as very probably accurate, even if the precise physical details recorded years later by John Hall cannot be verified with full confidence. What remains genuinely uncertain is narrower, but no less persistent. The exact building in Calais where the killing occurred has never been definitively identified by modern historians, with Prince's Inn itself drawn from later, second-hand references rather than a contemporary document naming the site outright. No burial examination, comparable to the one conducted on Henry VI's remains in 1910 has ever been carried out on Thomas of Woodstock's body, interred at Westminster Abbey, to independently confirm the manner of death described in Hall's confession, and the full extent of Richard II's direct involvement, whether he issued an explicit order to kill or simply made his wishes clear enough that Mowbray understood what was expected of him without ever receiving written instruction, remains, as with so many royal killings of this period, a distinction the surviving evidence cannot fully resolve. Calais itself passed out of English hands centuries ago, its medieval buildings long since altered, demolished, or lost to the passing of time and repeated warfare across the intervening centuries. Somewhere within that vanished townscape, a king's uncle was held down and killed to spare his nephew the inconvenience of a trial, an outcome nearly every historian now accepts as true. Inside a room whose exact location, like so much else from that September in 1397, no one has ever been able to point to with certainty. Some mysteries hinge on how a person died. This one hinges on whether a person actually died at all, and on a claim so audacious that, when it first surfaced, it managed to convince an entire French town, several of the dead woman's own surviving brothers, and, for a time, seemingly the family itself. In the town of Orléans, in the archives of the municipal treasury, a set of payment records from the year 1436 still survive. Listing sums of money given to a woman, the entries themselves name outright Jeanne le Pucelle, Joan the maid, Joan of Arc, the very same Joan of Arc who, according to every mainstream historical account, had been burned at the stake in Rouen 5 years earlier, in May 1431, in front of thousands of witnesses, her ashes reportedly gathered afterward and thrown into the Seine specifically to prevent any relic or any claim from surviving her. And yet here, in the account books of a city that had once celebrated her as its liberator, is a woman receiving civic payment under her name in 1436, treated by at least some of Orléans' citizens as though she had never died at all. To understand why this claim found any traction whatsoever, it helps to remember exactly how singular and how public Joan of Arc's life and death had been. Born around 1412 in the village of Domremy in northeastern France, Joan claimed from adolescence to receive visions from saints, instructing her to support the Dauphin, Charles, in his struggle against English and Burgundian forces during the long conflict now known as the 100 Years' War. Improbably, she was granted an audience with Charles, convinced him and his advisors of her sincerity, and was given command authority alongside experienced military leaders during the Siege of Orléans in 1429. A siege the French relieved within days of her arrival, a turning point still celebrated in France today. Her subsequent campaign helped secure Charles's formal coronation later that year. Captured by Burgundian forces in 1430 and sold to their English allies, she was tried by an ecclesiastical court on charges of heresy, largely centered on her practice of wearing men's clothing, and was burned at the stake in the marketplace at Rouen on May 30th, 1431, at around 19 years of age. Her death was, by design, made as thoroughly public and undeniable as 15th century authorities could manage. English officials, aware of Joan's symbolic power to the French cause, insisted on an execution witnessed by hundreds, including English soldiers, French clergy sympathetic to the English cause, and ordinary townspeople of Rouen. Multiple independent chronicle accounts describe the execution in similar terms. Her body burned, then, according to several sources, the fire deliberately raked back to expose the charred remains to the crowd, to eliminate any possibility that witnesses might later claim she had somehow escaped, before the body was burned a second and even third time, and the remains cast into the Seine. It is difficult to imagine authorities taking greater care to prevent exactly the kind of claim that would surface, against all expectation, only 5 years later. And yet, surface it did. In 1436, a woman appeared in the Lorraine region of France, in the town of Metz, claiming to be Joan of Arc, alive and returned from what she described, according to surviving accounts, as either an escape from execution or an entirely different fate than the one recorded by the official chroniclers. What makes this episode genuinely difficult to dismiss as an obvious opportunist's scheme is what happened next. Two of Joan's own brothers, Jeanne and Pierre Dulis, both of whom had fought alongside her during her military campaigns and who would have had direct, personal knowledge of her appearance, mannerisms, and private history, appear in the historical record acknowledging this woman as their sister. Contemporary accounts describe the brothers escorting her, apparently without apparent hesitation or public denunciation, and treating her, at least for a period, as the genuine Joan returned. The woman, who would come to be known to history as Jeanne des Armoises, following her marriage that same year to a knight named Robert des Armoises, went on to live an active and, by the standards of the claim she was making, remarkably public life for several years afterward. She is documented traveling to Orléans in 1436, where she was received with apparent warmth by at least some residents of the city she had helped liberate 7 years earlier, and where the municipal payment records still preserved today confirm sums of money were indeed given to a woman identified in the town's own accounts as Jeanne la Pucelle. She reportedly met with members of the French court, and some accounts even place her in correspondence, direct or indirect, with the figures connected to King Charles VII himself, the very monarch Joan had helped crown. This is where the mainstream historical explanation, developed and refined by generations of scholars since, becomes necessary, and where the case for outright impersonation grows considerably stronger the further the timeline is examined. By 1440, the claim had collapsed entirely, and the collapse itself is nearly as well documented as the initial appearance. Jeanne des Armoises traveled to Paris that year, where she was brought before the Parlement of Paris, and under close questioning is recorded confessing that she was not, in fact, Joan of Arc, but rather a woman who had adopted the identity, reportedly for financial and social advantage. Most historians identify her as very likely Claude des Armoises, though her precise origins before 1436 remain only partially documented, and some scholarly uncertainty persists even around this identification. Following her confession, she largely disappears from the historical record, though scattered later references suggest she may have continued, in more limited and less public ways, to trade on the association for some additional years afterward. Given this confession, why does the case continue to draw scholarly and popular attention nearly 6 centuries later, rather than being treated as a straightforward, closed case of medieval fraud, no different in kind from the many other impostors who periodically emerged claiming royal or heroic identities throughout the medieval and early modern periods? The answer lies almost entirely in the behavior of Joan's own brothers, whose acceptance of Jeanne des Armoises remains the single hardest detail for the straightforward fraud explanation to fully account for. Jean and Pierre Dulis were not distant relations or casual acquaintances who might plausibly have been deceived by a skilled impersonator working from second-hand details of Joan's life. They had served alongside her in actual military campaigns, would have known her voice, her bearing, her specific manner of speech, and countless private details of shared family history that no outside impersonator, however well informed, could easily reproduce convincingly under sustained, close family scrutiny. Historians who favor the straightforward fraud explanation have offered several possible reasons for the brothers' apparent acceptance, none of which is fully satisfying on its own. Financial motive is the most commonly cited. Association with a living Joan of Arc, however implausible, could have offered the brothers social standing, land, or income that a properly grieved and buried heroine could no longer provide them. It's also been suggested that the brothers may have gone along with the claim publicly for pragmatic reasons, whatever their private doubts, aware that an entire region was eager to believe in Joan's survival and unwilling to be the ones to definitively extinguish that hope. Others have proposed a more sympathetic reading, suggesting that Jeanne des Armoises may have borne a striking physical resemblance to Jeanne, and that the brothers, whether through genuine confusion, wishful thinking, grief-driven denial, or some combination of all three, may have initially and sincerely believed she was their sister, before the claim gradually proved unsustainable under more rigorous outside examination in Paris 4 years later. Grief, after all, has a well-documented history of producing sincere misidentification even among close family members, particularly in circumstances as chaotic and traumatic as Joan's capture, trial, and execution had been for a family who may never have been permitted to view her remains directly, given how thoroughly English authorities had ensured the body's destruction. A smaller number of historians and researchers, operating well outside the mainstream consensus, have pushed the question further still, proposing that the entire framework built around Jeanne des Armoises' eventual confession deserves more scrutiny than it typically receives. Under this more speculative reading, the 1440 confession before the Parliament of Paris, delivered under pressure, before an ecclesiastical and royal body with every institutional reason to want the Joan of Arc question definitively closed, might itself represent a coerced or negotiated resolution rather than a fully voluntary admission of guilt. Proponents of this view point to the awkward political position King Charles VII occupied regarding Joan's fate. Having been crowned largely on the strength of Joan's claimed divine mission, Charles had a complicated interest in how her story was ultimately resolved. A Joan who had somehow survived her execution raised uncomfortable theological and political questions about the legitimacy of the heresy conviction that had condemned her, questions the French crown, still navigating a fragile peace process with England and Burgundy through the 1430s, may have preferred to avoid entirely, regardless of whether a survival claim was true. Mainstream historians remain for the most part unconvinced by this more speculative reading, and for good reason. The evidence for Joan's actual execution in 1431 is substantial, multiply attested by independent chroniclers with differing political allegiances, and consistent with the deliberate, almost obsessive thoroughness English authorities applied specifically to prevent any subsequent survival claim from gaining traction. The 1456 posthumous retrial that formally annulled Joan's heresy conviction, itself a well-documented process, initiated at the request of Joan's mother and surviving family members, and involving extensive testimony from over 100 witnesses who had known Joan personally, proceeded throughout on the clear and unquestioned assumption that she had died at Rouen in 1431, with no formal challenge to that basic premise raised during the extensive proceedings, despite the Jeanne des Armoises episode having unfolded barely 15 years earlier, and remaining presumably within living memory for many involved. And yet, the discomfort the case produces has never fully dissipated, precisely because so many of the surrounding details resist easy resolution even within the mainstream, most probable explanation. Why would two brothers who had fought at Joan's side, who understood better than almost anyone what was genuinely at stake in either confirming or denying such a claim, apparently accept an impostor closely enough and publicly enough to escort her into cities that had once celebrated their sister as a national deliverer? Why did the city of Orléans, whose own citizens had witnessed Joan's actions firsthand only 7 years earlier, extend municipal payments to this woman under Joan's own name, an act that suggests, at minimum, a level of civic uncertainty or willful belief considerably beyond simple credulity toward a random traveling opportunist. Some historians have suggested a further, less dramatic possibility worth weighing alongside the others, that Jeanne des Armoises never claimed, at least not initially or explicitly, to literally be Joan of Arc risen from the flames, but rather allowed ambiguous rumors and eager regional hope to construct that identification around her, benefiting from a legend already primed by an unusually devoted and grief-stricken French public, still processing the loss of their most extraordinary wartime figure barely half a decade earlier. Under this reading, the brothers' apparent acceptance may reflect less a genuine mistaken identification and more a shared, complicated willingness to participate in a comforting fiction that served multiple purposes at once, for a family and a nation still working through the trauma of an execution few in France had ever fully accepted as just. What remains, across nearly 6 centuries of examination, is a documented sequence of events that no single explanation accounts for with complete satisfaction. Joan of Arc's execution in 1431 stands among the most thoroughly witnessed and documented deaths of the medieval period, deliberately staged by hostile authorities, specifically to prevent exactly the kind of survival claim that emerged just 5 years later. And yet that claim did emerge, was apparently accepted, at least for a time, by family members with every capacity to recognize deception, was formally recorded in the account books of a city that owed Joan its liberation, and was ultimately dismantled only under direct pressure from the very royal and ecclesiastical authorities who had the strongest institutional interest in ensuring the Joan of Arc story remained closed. Was Jeanne des Armoises simply a remarkably successful and well-informed impostor, exploiting a grieving nation's reluctance to fully accept its heroine's brutal end, aided by brothers whose motives, whether financial, sentimental, or some blend of both, led them to a willing complicity that unraveled only once officials in Paris demanded a resolution the regional legend could no longer sustain? Or does the willingness of Joan's own family to publicly accept her, however briefly, point toward a genuinely unresolved gap in the historical record surrounding the final days of Joan's life? One that the deliberate thoroughness of her execution and the swift, decisive verdict of the 1440 Parlement proceedings may have closed institutionally, without ever fully closing it in the private convictions of those who had known her best. The account books in Orléans still list the payment, made in good faith by a city that had every reason to know its own liberator, to a woman it called, for a time and without apparent hesitation, Jeanne la Pucelle. If the mystery of Jeanne des Armoises turns on whether a single woman truly died when the record says she did, the mystery that follows asks a far larger and far more contested question: whether an entire voyage, an entire colony, an entire chapter of pre-Columbian history ever happened at all. On a bluff overlooking the Alabama River, near the town of Montgomery, a stone marker placed by the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1953 still stands, its inscription bold and unambiguous. In memory of Prince Madoc, a Welsh explorer, who landed on the shores of Mobile Bay in 1170 and left behind, with the Indians, the Welsh language. It is one of the more extraordinary historical claims still commemorated with an official plaque anywhere in North America, and it rests on a foundation that professional historians, almost without exception, regard as entirely unproven. The legend begins not in Alabama, but in Wales, and in the fractured, violence-prone royal house of Gwynedd, one of the medieval kingdoms of northern Wales. According to the story as it eventually developed, Madoc was a son of Owain Gwynedd, a genuinely historical king of Gwynedd who ruled through much of the 12th century and died in 1170. Owain's death, as was common among medieval Welsh dynasties, triggered a bitter succession struggle among his numerous sons, several of them illegitimate, all with competing claims and no clear system of primogeniture to resolve the dispute peacefully. According to the legend, Madoc, dismayed by the violence consuming his homeland, gathered a small fleet and sailed west across the Atlantic, discovering a rich and hospitable land far beyond any territory known to medieval Europe. He returned briefly to Wales, the story continues, to recruit additional settlers, then sailed west again with a larger expedition, and was never heard from again, at least not in any historical record kept in Wales itself. It is, on its face, a compelling story, and one with an obvious problem. No version of it appears anywhere in the extensive body of medieval Welsh chronicles, poetry, or genealogical records compiled in the centuries immediately following Owain Gwyned's death. Medieval Wales maintained a rich literary and genealogical tradition, one that took the lineages and exploits of ruling families extremely seriously, and Owain Gwynedd himself is well documented in these sources as a significant historical figure. Yet nothing resembling the Madog story appears in any Welsh text that can be reliably dated earlier than the 16th century, fully 400 years after the voyage supposedly took place. The earliest known written references to Madog's voyage appear in the work of Humphrey Llwyd, a Welsh historian and antiquarian writing in the 1550s and 1560s, and the story was picked up and popularized shortly afterward by the English writer Richard Hakluyt, whose accounts of English and British exploration helped shape Elizabethan-era ideas about the New World. This timing is, to put it mildly, difficult to separate from its political context. England, under Elizabeth I, was locked in intense competition with Spain over rival claims to the Americas, and a legend establishing prior Welsh, and by extension British, discovery of the New World. Centuries before Columbus would have offered a uniquely convenient legal and political argument, bolstering English claims against Spanish assertions of prior right. Was the Madoc legend, then, simply invented, or substantially embellished, in the 16th century for precisely this strategic purpose, dressed up as ancient Welsh tradition to serve very current Elizabethan geopolitical interests? Many historians believe exactly that, and the case for skepticism is considerably strengthened by what happened to the legend over the following centuries, as it grew rather than settled, accumulating new supposed evidence long after any genuine oral or written tradition could plausibly have survived intact. The most significant addition came in the late 18th century, when reports began circulating, particularly among Welsh communities both in Britain and in the newly independent United States, describing a Native American tribe supposedly speaking a language containing recognizable Welsh words and exhibiting physical characteristics, lighter skin in some accounts, that observers attributed to European ancestry. The tribe most frequently identified in these accounts was the Mandan, a Siouan-speaking people living along the upper Missouri River, whose distinctive circular earth lodges, oval bull boats constructed from animal hide stretched over a wooden frame, and, according to some reports, lighter-eyed or lighter-haired individuals within the tribe struck a number of 18th and 19th century European and American observers as suggestively different from surrounding indigenous nations. This theory gained enough serious traction that it directly shaped exploration policy at the highest level. John Evans, a young Welshman driven by genuine belief in the Madoc legend, traveled to America in the 1790s specifically to locate the supposed Welsh-speaking Indians, eventually making contact with the Mandan themselves after an arduous and dangerous journey up the Missouri River. Evans lived among the Mandan for a period, studying their language and customs directly, and his conclusion, communicated afterward in his own writing, was unambiguous. He found no evidence of Welsh language, Welsh ancestry, or any connection to a medieval Welsh colony whatsoever. It's a conclusion that receives comparatively little attention in popular retellings of the Madoc legend, despite coming from the single most qualified and motivated investigator to ever conduct first-hand fieldwork specifically to test the claim. Evans's negative findings didn't end the theory, however, and interest in a Mandan-Welsh connection persisted well into the following century, receiving further, if equally inconclusive, attention following the work of American painter George Catlin, who lived among and extensively documented the Mandan in the 1830s. Shortly before a devastating smallpox epidemic in 1837 killed the overwhelming majority of the tribe's population, reducing what had been a community of well over 1,000 people to a small fraction of its former size within a single catastrophic season. Catlin, struck by aspects of Mandan culture and physical appearance he considered unusual compared to neighboring tribes, speculated in his own writing about possible European connections, without ever presenting concrete linguistic or genealogical evidence sufficient to satisfy rigorous examination. Modern anthropological and linguistic scholarship has, with very few exceptions, thoroughly rejected any genuine Welsh-Mandan connection. Systematic linguistic analysis conducted in the 19th and 20th centuries found no substantive Welsh vocabulary embedded within the Mandan language, which linguists classify confidently within the Owain language family, sharing clear, well-documented roots with related languages spoken by neighboring Plains tribes rather than with any Celtic language. The perceived physical differences noted by earlier observers are generally explained by modern researchers as either the product of ordinary genetic variation naturally present within any human population, or, in some specific cases, as a plausible result of documented, verifiable European admixture from French-Canadian fur traders, who maintained substantial and well-recorded contact with Mandan communities along established trade routes for generations before Catlin's visit, a far more historically supportable explanation than a Welsh voyage that left no confirmed documentary trace anywhere in the intervening 6 centuries. Beyond the Mandan connection, generations of Madoc enthusiasts have pointed to a scattering of additional physical evidence across the American landscape, none of which has withstood serious archaeological or historical scrutiny. Structures known as the Fort Mountain Stone Walls in Georgia and similar stone fortifications found at Devil's Backbone in Kentucky have periodically been attributed to Welsh construction techniques, distinct from the building methods typically associated with the region's indigenous populations. Archaeological investigation of these sites, however, has generally attributed them to pre-contact Native American construction, built for defensive or ceremonial purposes entirely unconnected to any European presence, with no artifacts, inscriptions, or dating evidence recovered from any of these sites supporting a medieval Welsh origin. Similarly, various inscribed stones purporting to contain Welsh or Old Welsh script have surfaced periodically since the 18th century across several states, including a particularly famous example known as the Devon, later Democrat, stone. Each has, upon expert linguistic examination, failed to hold up as genuine medieval Welsh, with most now regarded by specialists as either natural rock formations misread as inscriptions, later-era carvings of uncertain but clearly more recent origin, or outright fabrications produced by individuals eager to supply the physical proof the legend had otherwise always lacked. Given this accumulated weight of negative evidence, why has the Madoc legend endured so persistently, not only in popular imagination, but, as recently as 1953, in an official historical marker placed by a respected American heritage organization? Part of the answer lies in the legend's genuine usefulness across multiple eras and multiple, sometimes conflicting, purposes. For 16th century England, it offered a legal claim to precedence over Spain in the Americas. For 18th and 19th century Welsh communities, both in Britain and among Welsh immigrants establishing new lives in the United States, the story offered something considerably more personal: a sense of ancient, foundational belonging to the American continent, a claim of arrival that predated not only the young United States itself, but even the more established English colonial presence, at a time when Welsh cultural identity within Britain was itself under considerable pressure from English political and linguistic dominance. For American communities more broadly in the 19th century, particularly during a period of active westward expansion and displacement of indigenous nations, a legend suggesting prior European contact and eventual absorption into native populations served, whether consciously or not, certain convenient cultural narratives about the continent's history that a purely indigenous origin story did not. None of this cultural utility, of course, constitutes historical evidence one way or the other regarding what may or may not have actually happened in the 12th century. And this is ultimately where the Madoc mystery differs somewhat from several of the others explored so far in this survey. Unlike the Zeno narrative, which at least rests on a genuine 16th century document whose authenticity and accuracy remain seriously contested, or the disappearance of the Greenland colony, which is grounded in confirmed archaeological settlements and documented medieval correspondence, the Madoc legend possesses no comparable foundation of contemporary evidence at all. There is no 12th century Welsh document describing the voyage. There is no archaeological site in North America that has withstood expert examination as evidence of a genuine medieval European presence predating the Norse settlements already confirmed at Los Olmedos in Newfoundland, themselves dated to approximately the year 1000, nearly 2 centuries before Madoc's supposed voyage. There is no linguistic evidence, despite extensive and genuinely motivated searching by figures like John Evans, who traveled deep into unmapped territory, specifically hoping to find it, and returned having found nothing. And yet the story has never entirely disappeared, in part because proving a negative across 9 centuries of incomplete historical record is, by its nature, extraordinarily difficult. The absence of a Welsh document doesn't prove Madoc never sailed. It may simply reflect the ordinary loss of records common across medieval Wales, a period and place whose surviving written record is genuinely fragmentary, in many respects unrelated to this particular legend. The failure to identify conclusive archaeological evidence doesn't prove a small 12th century expedition couldn't have made landfall somewhere along an enormous, largely unexplored coastline, and left behind no trace that has survived 9 subsequent centuries of erosion, later settlement, and environmental change. A small group of colonists, even if they had genuinely arrived, would very plausibly have been absorbed within a few generations into surrounding indigenous populations, their distinct European origin diluted and eventually lost within the ordinary processes of intermarriage and cultural adaptation, long before any European observer arrived centuries later with the linguistic and ethnographic tools that might have detected genuine, rather than coincidental, traces of that origin. This is not an argument that the Madoc voyage happened. The overwhelming weight of historical and archaeological evidence, or rather the near total absence of any such evidence where it would most reliably be expected to survive, places the burden of proof heavily against the legend, and the great majority of professional historians regard it, at best, as an unproven medieval folk tradition retroactively dressed in far more specific detail by later politically motivated writers, or, at worst, as a substantially 16th century invention with only the thinnest possible connection, if any, to a genuine earlier Welsh oral tradition. But it is, perhaps, worth sitting with the shape of the uncertainty itself, rather than dismissing it outright. Owain Gwynedd was a real king, whose death in 1170 did trigger the kind of succession crisis the legend describes. Medieval Welsh sailors were demonstrably capable, by that period, of substantial coastal and open-water voyages within the eastern Atlantic. The story, whatever its true origins, took hold with the specificity of names dates and locations somewhat unusual for a legend built entirely from nothing. And North America's coastline in the 12th century remained, from any European vantage point, an almost entirely undocumented expanse, vast enough that the complete absence of surviving evidence for one small forgotten landing cannot, by itself, be treated as absolute proof that no such landing ever took place. The stone marker still stands on its bluff above the Alabama River, its confident inscription describing an arrival that the overwhelming consensus of modern historians regards as almost certainly unproven, and quite possibly invented outright centuries after the fact. A monument in the end, less to a confirmed piece of medieval history than to how persistently a compelling story can outlive the evidence required to sustain it. A legend about a lost colony asks whether anyone ever arrived. What follows asks a quieter, more intimate question. If they did, what became of the people themselves, generation after generation, as their story dissolved into the populations around them? In a small parish church in Powys, mid-Wales, a stained glass window installed in the 19th century commemorates Prince Madog's voyage, showing his ship departing beneath a stylized medieval sun. It is one of several such memorials scattered across Wales, each treating the prince's departure not as the end of a story, but as its opening chapter, the beginning of a bloodline that, if the old traditions are believed, continued for centuries on a continent no European was supposed to have reached. The trouble, as with the voyage itself, is that no continuous verifiable record exists to trace where that bloodline might have gone. We've already examined the strongest and most sustained of these claims, the 18th and 19th century belief that the Mandan people of the upper Missouri River preserved in their language, boat construction, and physical appearance the diluted inheritance of Madog's original settlers. That theory, tested directly by John Evans in the 1790s and found wanting, and later examined by linguists who found no genuine Welsh substrate within the Siouan-derived Mandan language, represents only the most thoroughly investigated branch of a much wider and considerably messier tradition. Because the Mandan were never the only nation identified, across 3 centuries of European and American speculation, as the possible inheritors of Madog's line, and it's in the sheer number and inconsistency of these competing identifications that the deeper mystery of the Descendants question really takes shape. Reports of Welsh Indians, native communities exhibiting some combination of lighter complexion, blue or gray eyes, an unusual fluency in what settlers believed sounded like Welsh, or oral traditions describing pale-skinned ancestors arriving by boat generations earlier, surface repeatedly throughout the colonial and early American record, attached to a remarkably wide range of tribes across a remarkably wide geography. In the early 18th century, colonial administrators and missionaries in Virginia and the Carolinas recorded encounters with the Doeg and Tuscarora peoples that some contemporary observers interpreted through a Welsh lens, citing isolated words that sounded, to untrained colonial ears, similar to Welsh vocabulary. Further south and west, similar claims eventually attached themselves to the Cherokee, and further west still, to the Paducah, and in some of the more geographically ambitious versions of the legend circulating by the early 19th century, to the Hopi and Zuni peoples of the American Southwest, whose distinctive Zuni language, a linguistic isolate unrelated to any neighboring tongue, struck some 19th century amateur ethnographers as sufficiently mysterious in origin to invite speculation about a lost European connection, however geographically implausible such a connection would have to be to account for a medieval Atlantic landing eventually producing a settled population deep in the interior Southwest. None of these claims, examined individually, survive close linguistic or genealogical scrutiny any better than the Mandan theory did. The Tuscarora and Cherokee languages belong to well-documented, unrelated language families, Iroquoian and Iroquoian adjacent in the Tuscarora case, and the distinct Cherokee branch of the same broader family, with no substantive Welsh vocabulary identified by modern linguists working with far more rigorous comparative tools than were available to 18th century observers working from impressionistic hearing alone. Zuni remains, to this day, a genuine linguistic isolate. Its origin still not fully resolved by modern linguistics, but unresolved origin and Welsh origin are very different claims, and no serious comparative linguistic study has found the kind of systematic correspondence with Welsh that would support the latter. What's striking, though, is not any individual claim's weakness, but the pattern across all of them together. Why did so many different European and American observers, across such a wide geographic and chronological range, independently arrive at the same interpretive framework? Pale or unusual features, a puzzling word here or there, an oral tradition of distant arrival by water, and consistently reach for the same explanation, generation after generation, tribe after tribe? Mainstream historians and anthropologists offer a fairly consistent answer. Colonial observers, primed by Humphrey Lewis and Richard Hakluyt's 16th century popularization of the Madog legend, were essentially looking for confirmation of a story they already wanted to be true, and human perception, particularly across a genuine language barrier and centuries of cultural distance, is remarkably good at finding the patterns it expects to find. A handful of superficially similar-sounding words, drawn from languages as different from Welsh and from each other as Sioan, Iroquoian, and the Zuni isolate, is statistically almost guaranteed to occur by pure chance alone, particularly when the listener is actively searching for exactly that kind of resemblance. This explanation accounts for a great deal, and most professional historians and linguists regard the broader Welsh-Indian tradition as a product of exactly this kind of motivated pattern-seeking, layered repeatedly onto different populations across 3 centuries of colonial contact, rather than evidence of any genuine shared ancestry. But it leaves at least one thread only partially addressed: the handful of specific, named genealogical claims that persisted, generation after generation, within particular families both in Wales and among certain American communities, who maintained, privately and without the benefit or burden of national publicity, a family tradition of Madog descent passed down through their own specific lineage, quite apart from the broader, more publicly debated tribal theories. These family traditions are, almost by definition, difficult to verify or refute using the tools available to conventional historical research. Oral genealogical claims maintained privately within families rarely produce the kind of documentary trail, land deeds, parish records, wills, that historians rely on to confirm or dismiss more public historical claims. Some Welsh American families, particularly in regions of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the Welsh tract of Pennsylvania, that received substantial Welsh immigration beginning in the late 17th century, maintained multi-generational family stories, asserting an ancestral connection to Madog's original expedition. Understood within these families not as a claim about broader tribal ancestry, but as a specific genealogical inheritance, a line of descent believed to run continuously from the 12th century prince down through subsequent generations of settlers, intermarriage, and eventual return migration or parallel Welsh immigration centuries later. Modern genetic genealogy has, in the past 2 decades, offered a tool that earlier generations of Madog researchers simply didn't have access to, and a small number of individuals and family history researchers have pursued Y chromosome and broader autosomal DNA testing specifically, hoping to identify a genetic signature connecting documented Welsh lineages to Native American populations in a pattern consistent with a medieval rather than colonial era admixture event. The results, to date, have not produced anything resembling scientific confirmation. Where Native American ancestry has been documented within families also claiming Welsh heritage, genetic genealogists have generally been able to trace that admixture to the well-documented, extensively recorded intermarriage between Welsh colonial settlers and indigenous communities that occurred routinely throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries in North America. Ordinary, historically unremarkable unions occurring 500 years after Madog's supposed voyage, rather than evidence of any 12th century event. No published, peer-reviewed genetic study has identified a distinct European genetic marker within any Native American population that can be confidently dated to the medieval period rather than to the far better documented colonial era. This absence of genetic confirmation weighs heavily against the Descendants theory, in the same way the absence of confirmed archaeological or linguistic evidence weighed against the original voyage. And yet, much as with the voyage itself, the negative evidence here carries its own limitations worth acknowledging honestly. Genetic genealogy is a comparatively young field, still refining its ability to distinguish and date distant admixture events with precision, particularly across a gap of 8 or 9 centuries and multiple subsequent generations of intermarriage that would have diluted any original genetic signal to vanishingly small and increasingly difficult to detect proportions. A small 12th century colonizing group, even if it had genuinely existed and successfully integrated into a Native American community, might plausibly have left behind a genetic contribution too diffuse after 25 or more subsequent generations of intermarriage for current testing methods to reliably isolate and confidently date. There is also the question of which populations have actually been tested, and how thoroughly. Given the sheer number of tribes historically associated with the Welsh Indian tradition across 3 centuries of shifting speculation, the Mandan, the Tuscarora, the Cherokee, the Doeg, the Zuni, and others besides, no comprehensive, systematic genetic survey has been conducted across all of these populations specifically designed to test for a shared medieval European contribution. The negative findings that do exist are drawn primarily from more limited targeted studies and from the broader, well-established genetic profile of these populations as documented in unrelated research, rather than from a dedicated, large-scale investigation built specifically to resolve the Madog descendants question once and for all. So the mystery, if it can still fairly be called one, occupies an unusual position among the cases explored so far in this survey. Unlike the murder of Thomas of Woodstock, where multiple independent lines of evidence converge on a probable, if not fully detailed, explanation, or the disappearance of the Norse Greenland colony, grounded in confirmed archaeological settlements and a documented final written record, the question of Madog's descendants rests almost entirely on the absence of evidence rather than its presence, an absence that could reflect either a legend with no genuine historical event behind it at all, or the almost inevitable dilution and eventual disappearance of any small founding population's traceable inheritance across 9 centuries of intermarriage, migration, and the ordinary erosion of oral tradition into unreliable legend. Descendants, by their nature, don't announce themselves. A population that begins as visibly distinct gradually, generation after generation, blends into its surroundings. Its founding story surviving, if at all, only as a fragment of oral tradition increasingly difficult to distinguish from later invention, wishful embellishment, or simple coincidence. If Madog's expedition did reach North America, and did establish some lasting presence among indigenous communities, the very success of that integration, the disappearance of any lasting cultural or linguistic distinction, would, paradoxically, be the clearest evidence of the settlers having genuinely lived among, rather than remained separate from, the populations who received them. And that same successful integration is precisely what would make their eventual descendants, whoever and wherever they may be, functionally invisible to the historical and genetic tools available to trace them today. Was there ever a distinct Madog bloodline to trace at all? Or does the entire pattern, the family traditions, the tribal identifications, the persistent search for confirmation across 3 centuries, and more recently, across strands of DNA, represent nothing more than a story too emotionally satisfying for successive generations to ever fully release, each new generation of researchers finding new tools and new populations to test against a legend that has, so far, withstood every method used to confirm or finally disprove it? Or does the growing precision of genetic science, still developing new techniques for detecting increasingly distant and diluted ancestral contributions, hold the possibility of eventually resolving, one way or the other, a question that oral tradition, colonial speculation, and 19th century ethnography never could? The stained glass window in that Powys church remains exactly what it has always been. A monument not to a confirmed lineage, but to an unbroken hope that one might still exist, somewhere, carried forward in the blood of people who may never know and may never be able to know, precisely where their own ancestry actually begins.